Wait. Mason paused as the little animal's ears grew unusually long and pointed. The strange patterns running down its body were sharp, not like the spots or swirls usually seen on wild dogs, but something more feral. Mason's hand froze on the towel, the excitement and pride at saving the little creature quickly giving way to a vague sense of unease. The strangeness reminded him of just an hour ago, when the storm turned his driveway into a river of mud. He was rushing from his car to his house, his jacket pulled tight over his head against the pouring rain, when a faint whimper sent him shivering. It was a small, fragile sound, almost drowned out by the pounding of the rain on the pavement. He paused, trying to listen again. When it came, weak and shaky, Mason instinctively turned toward the bushes near his porch. The rhododendrons were thick and dripping, their leaves heavy with water. Mason knelt down, pushed aside the branches, and squinted through the sheets of rain. That was when he saw it. A small figure, hunched and shivering, its fur matted with mud and rain. "It looks like a puppy," was his first thought. It looked at him with wide eyes, terrified and desperate and pleading in a way that tugged at something deep inside him. He didn't think anymore. Mason held out his hand and waited. For a moment, the creature remained frozen. Mason whispered softly to it, trying to stay as still as possible, even as the cold rain soaked through his clothes. "It's okay, little one," his voice barely audible over the storm. Finally, as if surrendering to exhaustion, it inched forward on unsteady limbs. Step by shaky step, it drew closer until Mason could scoop it up, wrapping it carefully in his jacket. It was small, far smaller than he expected, and it trembled uncontrollably against him. Mason didn't waste time. He rushed inside, the storm raging behind him as he kicked the door shut. He knelt by the fireplace and set the creature down on a towel, its frail body practically sinking into the soft fabric. The room was silent, except for the crackling of the fire and the occasional low rumble of thunder in the distance. Mason worked quickly, rubbing the mud from its fur, murmuring soothing words as he did. Beneath the dirt, the patterns on its coat came into view, strange, almost unnatural swirls that reminded him of something wild, something untamed. So he named it Blaze. The house was warm and still, the crackling fireplace filling the quiet with its rhythmic pops. Outside, the rain pounded relentlessly, but inside Mason's living room, it felt like the world had paused. Blaze lay curled up in the towel Mason had set out, her small form unmoving, except for the slow rise and fall of her breathing. Mason watched her closely, brow furrowed. He'd picked up some squeaky toys and a bowl of soft dog food earlier, assuming the little creature would leap at the chance to play or eat. But Blaze ignored it all, her eyes distant, dark and strange. She wasn't behaving like a puppy, no tail wagging, no curiosity, no clumsy movements. Just silence. Mason sighed and sank into the chair opposite her. "Guess you're still getting used to things," he murmured, as if to himself. But Blaze didn't flick an ear, didn't stir at the sound of his voice. Outside the window, the rain beat harder, adding an ominous weight to the already peculiar evening. He sat there for a while longer, watching her, waiting for something to shift, but nothing did. When night fell, Mason carried Blaze upstairs and gently set her down on a blanket at the foot of his bed. "There, kiddo," he said softly. "You're safe here." He expected her to curl up, tuck her snout under a paw like most pups would. Instead, she lay perfectly still, her head lifted, ears perked, as if listening to something Mason couldn't hear. Her eyes were fixed on the darkened corners of the room. Mason hesitated, the unease bubbling in his chest. He slid under the covers and turned off the light, though he could still make out Blaze's silhouette in the dim glow of the street lamp outside. Minutes passed. Mason closed his eyes, exhaling slowly, but sleep didn't come. The room felt heavier, colder somehow. When his eyes fluttered open again, Blaze hadn't moved an inch. She was still staring, her gaze sharp, unblinking. Then he heard it. A low, rumbling sound. It was faint at first, like a growl trapped deep in her chest. The sound rolled out again, louder this time, sending a chill crawling down Mason's spine. He sat up, his heart pounding. "Blaze?" he whispered. The growl faded, but Blaze didn't look at him. Her eyes remained fixed on the corner. The hairs on the back of Mason's neck stood up. He forced himself to look into the darkness, straining to see whatever it was that had Blaze so transfixed. Nothing. Just empty shadows. But that growl, it hadn't sounded like any puppy he'd ever heard before. It was deeper, darker, as though it didn't belong in a house at all. Mason rubbed his face, trying to shake the growing sense of dread. Time crept by. Mason could hear the rain drumming on the windows, the faint creaks of the old house settling. Blaze finally lowered her head to rest on her paws, but her ears stayed rigid, pointed toward the unseen. One night, Mason sat in his dimly lit living room, laptop glowing in front of him. Blaze lay by the window, still as a statue, ears perked, eyes locked on something Mason couldn't see. That behavior, it wasn't just unusual, it was unsettling. Blaze wasn't playful, didn't chase balls, didn't wag his tail like other pups. Instead, he watched, guarded, moved with the silent precision of something that didn't belong in Mason's world. His fingers hovered over the keyboard before typing, "Is my puppy not a puppy?" It felt like the right title for the blog. Short, catchy, curious. He uploaded the first video, Blaze sitting perfectly still, tracking unseen movements outside. Mason had filmed it earlier that morning. The second video, though, was the one that had him rubbing his neck. Blaze had crouched low in the hallway at midnight, emitting a low, guttural sound. Not barking, not growling. Something else. Mason had felt his hair stand on end just hearing it. After hitting publish, Mason leaned back, sipping lukewarm coffee. At first, the comments trickled in light-heartedly. "Lol, you adopted a mini werewolf. Probably just a wolf dog mix, dude. Chill." But then, things shifted. A user named NatureHunter67 replied, "That sound isn't from any dog I've heard. Might want to get it checked." Another wrote, "That's not a normal coat pattern. Looks wild to me." More theories poured in. Hybrid wolves, exotic pets smuggled from overseas, even whispers of cryptids from forgotten forests. Mason chuckled at the crazier suggestions, but something gnawed at him. Others shared similar videos of their pets behaving oddly, comparing Blaze to rare breeds, but none matched perfectly. Blaze was different. Too different. The blog post blew up overnight. Thousands of views, shares across social media, and a flood of messages. Some were concerned, urging Mason to be cautious. A wildlife expert from a small forum commented that Blaze's stillness and vocalizations mirrored those of wild animals protecting their territory. Others were drawn to the mystery, demanding answers Mason didn't have. Under pressure, Mason uploaded a follow-up post the next morning. This time he wrote, "I'll take Blaze to the vet this week. Maybe we'll solve this mystery together." But he hesitated before hitting send. Mason glanced at Blaze, who was no longer by the window. Instead, the pup, if he could still call it that, stood in the middle of the room, staring directly at him. The look wasn't hostile, but it wasn't innocent either. For a brief second, Mason felt like Blaze could read every word he'd just typed. That night, sleep eluded him. Around 3 a.m., a noise woke Mason, a sharp, high-pitched screech echoing through the house. He bolted upright, heart pounding. Blaze was already gone. Mason grabbed a flashlight, rushing down the hallway, the beam cutting through shadows. He found Blaze in the backyard. The pup crouched low in the wet grass, body rigid, teeth bared. Across the yard, a coyote snarled, pacing along the tree line. Its eyes glinted yellow, but it didn't approach. Blaze didn't back down. His stance, defensive, protective, made Mason freeze. He realized Blaze wasn't scared, he was guarding. The coyote finally turned and disappeared into the trees. Only then did Blaze relax, turning to Mason with something close to relief. The flashlight caught the mud streaked across Blaze's fur, his chest heaving, and for the first time, Mason understood. This wasn't about instincts or territory. Blaze had protected him. The next morning, Mason scrubbed mud off Blaze's paws, his hands trembling slightly. He thought about that stare, that growl. Something deeper, primal. Love? Loyalty? Maybe both. He clicked into his blog and began typing, this time slower, more deliberately. Last night, Blaze protected me. A coyote wandered too close to the house. I don't know what he is. Maybe part wild, maybe something more. But I do know this. Whatever Blaze is, he's here for a reason. It didn't take long for the comments to explode again. Mason didn't check them this time. Instead, he sat on the floor next to Blaze, running a hand along the pup's back. Blaze didn't flinch. His body relaxed, settling into Mason's side. The days ahead would bring answers, Mason knew. He had promised his readers a trip to the vet, and he'd keep that promise. Blaze wasn't ordinary, but he wasn't dangerous either. Later that afternoon, Mason received an email from a local wildlife conservationist. The subject line read, "I think I know what you have." Mason hesitated, his cursor hovering over the message. He glanced at Blaze, who lay curled on the rug, watching him again with those intelligent eyes. The truth was coming whether Mason wanted it or not. Before opening the email, he reached out and scratched behind Blaze's ear. For the first time since the storm, Blaze wagged his tail. Mason smiled, even as his gut told him that whatever was in that email would change everything. It didn't matter right now. Blaze was safe. For now, that was enough. Next morning, Mason's hands still trembled slightly as he gripped the steering wheel. The smell of burnt fabric lingered faintly on his clothes. Blaze had saved him this morning. There was no other way to describe it. If the creature hadn't growled, sharp and deliberate, Mason wouldn't have turned in time to see the towel smoldering. It was a small fire, but fires grew fast. Too fast. Now, with Blaze silent in the back seat, Mason couldn't stop glancing in the rearview mirror. The animal's gaze was steady, unblinking, as though it understood everything. The vet visit couldn't wait. Mason knew it was a long shot. Adrian had warned him just yesterday about his unpredictable schedule. Still, Mason needed answers. Blaze wasn't acting like any stray he'd ever seen, and after this morning, Mason was certain. This was no ordinary creature. Pulling into the parking lot, Mason killed the engine and let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Blaze shifted slightly, ears flicking as if sensing the change in Mason's demeanor. It was strange. He'd never seen such intensity from an animal so small. He reached into the back seat and hesitated. "All right, buddy. Let's figure out what you are." Blaze's head turned toward him slowly, almost deliberately, before stepping forward into Mason's waiting arms. Inside, the receptionist greeted him with a forced smile. Mason barely listened as she explained that Dr. Adrian wasn't in today. A replacement vet wouldn't arrive until next week. Mason swallowed his frustration. The waiting room buzzed with the usual chaos, barking dogs, impatient meowing cats, but Blaze ignored it all, perched calmly on Mason's lap, muscles coiled like springs. More than one pet owner cast furtive glances at the unusual puppy, whispering to each other as Mason sat back down. "Sorry, kid," Mason muttered, scratching Blaze's ears absent-mindedly. He didn't know if Blaze could understand him, but he couldn't stop himself from talking. "Looks like we'll have to wait." Blaze remained still, eyes fixed on the door. The drive home was quieter than Mason expected. Blaze sat perfectly still in the passenger seat now, head tilted slightly, as if listening to something far beyond Mason's hearing. It unnerved him, but not in the way he thought it would. There was no malice in Blaze's behavior, just awareness. As if Blaze knew he'd stepped into Mason's life for a reason. When they arrived back at the house, Mason opened the car door, and Blaze leapt lightly to the ground. Mason followed, his keys jingling in his hand as he walked up the steps. He turned the handle and froze. The faintest noise, low, almost imperceptible, came from inside the house. Blaze heard it too. The creature tensed, ears rigid, eyes narrowing toward the doorframe. Mason pushed the door open and stepped cautiously inside. The noise came again, sharper now. It was the sound of claws scrambling against wood. Mason's heart pounded in his chest as he entered the kitchen. Blaze moved ahead of him like a shadow, gliding silently across the floor. Then Mason saw it. In the corner, under the kitchen table, a raccoon crouched, its eyes wide with panic. It must have slipped in while Mason was out, maybe through an unlocked window. But what caught Mason off guard was Blaze's reaction. The animal let out a deep, guttural growl, not threatening, not aggressive, protective. The raccoon froze under Blaze's stare, and for a moment, Mason swore the two creatures understood each other. The raccoon bolted, making a beeline for the back door. Blaze stayed still, his body tense, only relaxing when the intruder was gone. Mason let out a shaky laugh and leaned against the counter. "You're a real hero today, aren't you?" he said softly, more to himself than to Blaze. Twice now, the creature had sensed danger before Mason had. Twice, it had acted with an intelligence that startled him. He bent down to meet Blaze's eyes. For the first time, Mason thought he saw something deeper than instinct in that gaze, something almost maternal. Protectiveness, fierce and unwavering. That night, as Mason settled into bed, Blaze took his usual spot at the foot of the mattress. Mason lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that Blaze's actions hadn't been random. Twice, Blaze had kept him safe. Twice, it had watched over him as if he were the one who needed protection. Mason closed his eyes, the weight of the day finally pressing down on him. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, he dreamed of fire, rain, and a pair of sharp eyes watching him from the darkness, not with menace, but with love. Blaze's strange behavior escalated over the following days. Mason couldn't ignore the shift anymore, even if a quiet attachment had taken root. Each morning, he woke to find Blaze sitting still by the window, staring out into the yard with a motionless calm. The animal was always there before Mason's first steps, its figure steady as a sentinel. At first, it felt comforting, like someone watching over him, but as the days passed, the silence of it, Blaze's unwavering focus, felt heavy, like a weight Mason couldn't shake. One evening, Mason returned from work, shoulders slumped and feet dragging. The long day left him craving the stillness of home, but he stopped short at the door. Blaze was waiting, not at the window this time, but in the hallway, its body unmoving, eyes following Mason with an eerie kind of knowing. As Mason stepped inside, Blaze walked toward him, paused, then gently pressed its head against his leg. The contact was so small, so deliberate, that Mason froze. For the first time, it struck him. Blaze wasn't just a stray, it was something else entirely, something that seemed to understand more than it should. For a moment, Mason let his hand rest on the creature's head. "I'm home," he murmured softly, as if reassuring himself. The nights were worse. Once the neighborhood lights went out, Blaze's true nature began to reveal itself. Mason had fallen into a restless sleep the first time it happened, a deep, low sound vibrating through the house. It wasn't a bark or a whine. It was a sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth, rolling up from Blaze's throat and filling the air. Mason bolted upright, his pulse pounding. The noise echoed through the walls, slipping under doors and windows, seeping into the shadows. Outside, he saw lights flick on across neighboring houses. People were awake. They were listening. Over the next few nights, the sound became a pattern. Each time, Mason tried to calm Blaze, but the creature wouldn't move from its spot by the window. It sat there, ears perked, body tense, eyes locked on something unseen. Sometimes, it would tilt its head back and release the sound again, a drawn-out, mournful cry that didn't belong in the quiet suburban streets. Mason began to hear murmurs from his neighbors during the day. Strangers at the grocery store whispered as he passed by. A woman asked if he'd heard the animal at night, clutching her purse tightly as though saying it out loud might invite it closer. In his own home, the unease grew thicker. Mason couldn't shake the feeling that his house no longer belonged to him. Blaze's presence loomed larger than it should have. At night, when the sound came, Mason could feel it in his chest, like a vibration humming through his bones. It rattled through the floorboards, loud but never chaotic, always deliberate, always controlled. Mason couldn't explain it, but every time Blaze let out that sound, he swore he heard something stir in the walls, or maybe just in his mind. One evening, after another sleepless night, Mason sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at his cold coffee. His house felt darker, the air heavier. He turned his head slowly and saw Blaze, back by the window again. Its body was rigid, its eyes fixed outside. Mason felt his chest tighten. The room felt colder. He took a deep breath, the realization hitting him all at once. It wasn't just a stray animal. It wasn't just some unusual behavior. Blaze wasn't normal. The doubt that had nagged him since the beginning, the instincts he'd ignored out of pity, finally demanded his attention. The sounds, the behavior, the silence, none of it made sense anymore. Blaze wasn't a dog, and Mason couldn't pretend otherwise. He looked at the creature by the window, now so still, it looked like a statue. His voice cracked as he spoke, low and certain. "We're going back to the vet." Mason sat in his car outside the clinic, fingers drumming nervously against the steering wheel. Blaze sat quietly in the passenger seat, an unusual calm settling over the creature. The morning sun reflected off the glass windows of the veterinary office, but Mason barely noticed. Today, he would finally get answers. Inside the waiting room, the atmosphere shifted as soon as they entered. Eyes turned, hushed whispers spread like wildfire. Blaze, wrapped tightly in Mason's old jacket, let out a low, warning growl. The receptionist froze mid-sentence, her gaze flickering uneasily between Mason and the bundle in his arms. Mason offered an apologetic smile and hurried to a corner seat. "Calm down, buddy," Mason whispered. Blaze's golden eyes scanned the room, ears pinned back, every muscle tense. It wasn't like walking in with a Labrador. There was a sharp edge to Blaze, something feral lurking just below the surface, and Mason could feel the shift in the room's energy because of it. When the assistant called Mason's name, Blaze stiffened. The walk down the sterile white hallway was no better. Mason's heart pounded, his grip tightening as Blaze squirmed under his arm. Dr. Adrian, a stout, seasoned vet with silver hair and calm eyes, greeted them with a nod. "Let's see this little guy," he said softly, motioning to the table. The moment Mason set Blaze down, things spiraled. Blaze let out a guttural snarl, legs splayed in a defensive stance. "Easy, easy," Mason coaxed, trying to keep his voice steady. Dr. Adrian approached slowly, his movements deliberate. Blaze lashed out, twisting violently. A sharp, predatory sound ripped from its throat, nothing like the yips or whines of a dog. "Hold him still," Dr. Adrian instructed, his voice clipped but controlled. Mason leaned in, murmuring to Blaze, stroking its fur until, Finally, it settled into uneasy stillness. Adrian adjusted his glasses, his experienced hands gently moving over Blaze's body. He paused when he reached the jaw, carefully pressing Blaze's lips back to reveal its teeth. A beat passed, then another. The vet's hands froze. His expression shifted. First confusion, then a quiet, dawning realization. The silence thickened, broken only by the soft, rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. Adrian straightened abruptly, exhaling through his nose, his gaze fixing Mason with startling intensity. "These aren't dog teeth," he said, the words heavy. Mason blinked. "What do you mean?" Dr. Adrian's voice lowered. "The canines are elongated, sharp. That jaw structure, it's all wrong." He ran a trembling hand down Blaze's side, pressing lightly against the bones beneath the fur. His brow furrowed deeper. "And its musculature. This is not a domestic animal. It's built for strength, for hunting." Mason stared blankly, his mind struggling to keep up. "But I found it. It's just a puppy. It's not a puppy." Adrian stepped back, pulling off his gloves. "You've brought in a hyena. A young one, but a hyena nonetheless." The room spun. Mason gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. "A what?" He looked at Blaze, who was now still, watching them both with those unnerving eyes. "That's impossible." Adrian shook his head grimly. "Hyenas are powerful predators. They're wild animals, Mason. Even as juveniles, their instincts are strong, and they can be unpredictable. It's only a matter of time before this one starts behaving according to its nature." Mason opened his mouth, searching for words. He glanced at Blaze again. This small, trembling creature he'd dried off in his living room fed warm milk and held in his arms. How could that same animal now be labeled as dangerous? "I've been living with it for days," Mason said quietly. It hasn't done anything." "You've been lucky," Adrian replied, softening his tone. "But it can't stay with you. Hyenas need proper care in the right environment. They don't belong in homes. This one may look small now, but it will grow, and its instincts will surface. For your safety and the animal's well-being, I'll contact the local wildlife authorities. They'll know how to handle this." Mason's chest tightened. "There's no other way?" Adrian's expression was firm, though kind. "No. This isn't about you or how much you care for it. It's about what's best for the animal. You did the right thing by bringing it here, Mason. But now it's time to let the professionals take over." Mason sat alone in the isolation room, the quiet broken only by the faint hum of the ventilation system. Blaze lay curled up inside the metal cage, his small frame tense, but still. Mason leaned forward in the plastic chair, hands clasped tightly, his gaze fixed on the creature he had spent days caring for. The room felt colder than it should, its white walls clinical and unforgiving. Dr. Adrian had stepped out moments ago to make the call. The Center for Wildlife Conservation had agreed to take Blaze. Mason knew this was the only option, but the weight of that truth pressed on him like a stone. Blaze, the wild animal he had mistaken for a lost puppy, would soon be gone. Somewhere deep inside, he felt as though he was betraying a friend who had trusted him completely. Blaze shifted slightly in the crate, and Mason's eyes softened. He reached a hand toward the bars, hesitating when Blaze turned to look at him. Those eyes, sharp, intelligent, and wild, met his for a long moment. Then, with deliberate calm, Blaze moved closer and nudged his nose against Mason's outstretched fingers. The warmth of the touch made his throat tighten. A second later, Blaze licked the tip of Mason's hand gently, the same way he had done the night Mason found him in the rain. Mason froze, feeling the silent farewell in that small gesture. A sharp knock at the door broke the moment. Dr. Adrian stepped back in, his expression steady but solemn. "They're on their way," he said quietly. "They'll be here within the hour." Mason nodded, his eyes never leaving Blaze. He couldn't bring himself to respond, knowing that every word would crack beneath the weight of his emotions. The doctor's voice softened. "You did the right thing, Mason. He'll be safe there. He needs the right environment to thrive." Mason understood that. He did. But it didn't make it any easier. Blaze had become more than just an animal he'd rescued. In those quiet moments, when the house was empty and the rain lashed against the windows, Blaze had been a presence, a strange, silent comfort Mason hadn't realized he needed. Dr. Adrian left again to finalize preparations, leaving Mason and Blaze alone once more. The minutes stretched, the air heavy with unspoken words. Mason sat closer to the cage this time, resting his arm on his knee as he looked at Blaze. The creature lay still, but watched him closely, his eyes holding none of the fear they'd had when Mason first scooped him up under the rhododendron bush. "You'll be okay," Mason murmured softly, more to himself than to Blaze. He needed to believe that. When the wildlife team arrived to take Blaze away, Mason stood quietly in the corner of the room. The air felt heavier than usual, and every creak of the old wooden floors seemed louder. A young man from the team carefully approached Blaze's smaller cage and opened it. Blaze didn't move at first. For a moment, Mason thought the little creature might resist, might cling to the home they had shared, but Blaze simply lifted its head, calm and still, and stepped forward. Its small body eased into the larger, sturdier carrier as though it had accepted everything. Blaze didn't fight or look afraid. The stillness of its movements, the quiet dignity, felt almost human to Mason. Blaze's eyes, those same wild and intelligent eyes, lingered on him for a long moment. There was no panic now, no confusion, just a calm understanding, as if it somehow knew Mason was doing this out of love. Mason's throat tightened, but he kept his face steady. When Blaze was secured in the bigger cage, the young man turned toward Mason with a polite nod before lifting the carrier. Blaze shifted slightly, turning to look back one last time. That final glance hit Mason harder than he'd expected. Blaze's eyes were soft now, filled with something that Mason could only describe as peace. It wasn't sadness or fear. It wasn't wild. It was the look of trust. Trust that Mason had done the right thing. Mason's hand rose instinctively, a slow wave, as if to say goodbye, though no words came. The room felt emptier the moment the carrier disappeared through the front door. For a few long seconds, Mason stood there in silence, his ears catching the distant hum of the truck engine as it pulled away. Hours later, the house felt different. The usual creak of the floorboards under his feet, the faint hiss of the heater, everything seemed too loud in the absence of Blaze. Mason sat at his desk, fingers hovering over the keyboard, the glow of his laptop illuminating the dark room. He stared at the blank document for a long time before finally typing the title, "The Story of Blaze. When the Wild Comes Home." The words began to flow as he recounted it all, the storm, the discovery, the strange habits, the questions, and ultimately, the choice. Mason wrote not out of sadness, but out of purpose. He wanted people to know about Blaze, about the bond they'd shared and the lesson it had left behind. Wild creatures, no matter how small or vulnerable they might seem, belong to nature. They don't belong in houses with fireplaces and soft towels. Mason knew that now. He hoped his story would help others understand that too. By the time he finished, the rain had started again, soft and steady against the window. Mason pushed his chair back and stood, staring out into the misty afternoon. The rhododendron bushes near the edge of the yard swayed gently in the wind, the same bushes where he had found Blaze on that stormy night. He could almost see it again, the small, trembling figure, the cautious eyes staring up at him for the first time. Mason smiled faintly, a mix of sadness and gratitude washing over him. Blaze had left something behind, something Mason could feel even now, a shift in his life, in his perspective. The quiet reminder that sometimes the best way to love something is to let it go. With that thought, he turned off his laptop and walked to the kitchen to make a cup of coffee, the sounds of the house filling the silence once more. As the rain drummed steadily against the roof, Mason sat back in his armchair and closed his eyes for a moment. The house might feel emptier, but Mason didn't. Blaze had been here. And even though the little creature was gone, its presence remained, quiet and eternal, like the rhythm of the rain.